to speak briefly here. Chris asked me to reflect on some of my own research to address this question, not answer it, but address it. And I suppose I should start with some simple-minded assumptions that I have, that social research largely depends on public funding and therefore should address questions relevant to the public good. Secondly, there are many existing models of researcher-policymaker relationships, and I'll only be talking about one. Incidentally, I think Diane this morning was talking largely about another, which is really the researcher as expert or legislator or would-be aid to legislator. Whereas I'm going to be really talking about the social scientist as an interpreter, as opposed to a legislator. Now, all these models, whatever model, and I'm not going to go through them here, involve in some form the political process, even if it's part of a political process, even if that remains a small p. Now, my position, it's useful to think about one's own position here, and it is a university academic carrying out policy-relevant research, not directly commissioned by public agencies. In other words, I've been lucky enough and privileged enough to set some of my own questions, funded by bodies such as the SRC, European Union, and the HEA. The style of research I've been involved with is largely qualitative: sources, interviews, official documents, official statistics, and one which largely adopts what I would call a critical stance. Now, the main areas of research I've been looking at, and I will talk mainly about the first one here, cross-border cooperation in Ireland, funded by HEA and ESRC for the most part. That developed over the last few years into looking at cross-border cooperation on the eastern border of the EU in an FP6 project. And I'm currently involved in a 5-year project with people in Cambridge and Exeter on conflict in cities in the contested state, everyday life and possibilities of transformation in Belfast, Jerusalem, and a variety of other European and Middle Eastern cities. But I won't have time really to talk too much about that last one. Now, I've been looking at cross-border cooperation really in that time period there, and it's quite remarkable when I started in 1991 that I naively thought that, well, this was a pressing topic, the border. In fact, it was a very pressing topic in Northern Ireland in particular, but nobody was doing any research on it. Nobody was looking at how the border worked. This tells us a lot about the disjuncture between, if you like, the world of politics and the world of university research. Now, by and large, my focus has been on key actors, voluntary community groups, local politicians, civil servants, business people, EU officials. The context of the research, highly politicized, of course, shaped by the tortuous path of the peace process. Cross-border cooperation became wrapped up in the so-called peace process. Period also of unprecedented funding aimed at promoting socioeconomic development and building cross-communal and cross-border links. Cross-border cooperation, CBC for short, shaped by 2 state administrations, each with very different cultures, overlaid with the additional bureaucratic requirements of the EU. On top of that, for a lot of the programs. And yet one could say that programs of cross-border cooperation were innovative in an Irish context, developing sometimes in interesting ways models of cross-border cooperation previously around in Europe. Now, it's worth reflecting on this, of course. The bulk of research in this area is carried out not by academics at all, but by private consultants. And they were very much part of the whole process. Their evaluation research was built into the process of applying for funds and managing projects. It was shaped by the funders' requirements for monitoring, auditing, accountability, value for money, proof of dissemination, impact, all these buzzwords. And these requirements actually shaped the content and practice of cross-border cooperation. Now, the funded projects, cross-border projects, bias towards economic development as an objective in its own right, and as a means of peace and reconciliation. And also bias towards concrete or hard rather than soft outcomes. Buildings. Buildings particularly, improving the physical environment, but also sometimes improving the economy or providing jobs and whatever. Now, the qualitative research is undertaken by me, I suppose, was really focusing more on soft issues, the rhetoric of cross-border cooperation. How important is it? Is it all just talk? And I remember in the 90s going around the border talking to people, and everybody was talking about the wonderful cooperation that was going on. And I could see that there was no outcome, there's nothing happening, it's all talk. But I thought, this is bad, isn't it? And then I thought, on reflection, several years later, well, maybe it's not so bad, because there was also other forms of talk going on, which was very negative talk, very antagonistic talk, killing people talk, right? And this kind of talk at least was talk about cooperation, mutual benefit and so on, and it had some kind of positive role. The meaning of peace and reconciliation, much debated, much talked about. Then there was this kind of problematical connection between heavily funded hard activities, that's improving the economic and physical environment, and less well-funded soft activities, improving cross-communal relations, which tended to be delegated to the third sector, the voluntary and community groups, something that they should handle. And then there was the role of politics, which was always there. Now, the pervasive themes, I think, running throughout this research are the importance of culture. Now, this was a time, sometime, I always say sometime around the late 70s and early 80s, there was a redefinition of the Northern Ireland problem as a cultural problem, as one of clashing cultural identities. And the solution, therefore, I'm not necessarily decrying this, but this was it. And the way around it was recognition, institutional recognition of the two cultures. But, the question is here in terms of cross-border cooperation, what culture is problematic? Is it that of the communities on the ground, or the two states involved, or the European Union, or what have you? There was a question of sustainability, which is, again, pervasive. And then there was a pervasive ideology of partnership, even at local level, between state business and the third sector. Now, the interesting point is, of course, most of the money didn't address the cultural question directly at all. Very little money went into that, even though the Northern Ireland problem was defined as a cultural problem. It was actually directed at economic development and physical improvement on the basis that a byproduct of that would be better communal relations, which of course is something that doesn't necessarily follow. So the centrality of culture was one lesson I think I learned too. Qualitative sociology, qualitative social science, I think is well placed to analyse culture. The importance of talk, rhetoric of zero-sum conflict versus rhetoric of mutual benefit. Culture of innovation versus a culture of inertia. Now on this culture, I couldn't resist quoting one of our respondents, who was very active in a cross-border project in Leitrim, and had interesting, varied background experience himself, not just in the voluntary sector, but also in civil service. And he said, the conservative, short-sighted, very reactionary, constipated culture of so many institutions, in fact, both north and south, really inhibited any form of genuine healthy engagement or exploration of synergy between north and south. There's a huge impediment here. The cultures within individual organisations, within government departments, within development agencies. It's culture, culture, culture. Now, I couldn't resist here at quoting Brian Lucy, the Trench economist who's been in news over NAMA, who I shared a platform with on last Friday. And he said, culture will eat strategy for breakfast any day. And he was talking about reforming banks in current economic crisis and so And it struck me as quite relevant to cross-border cooperation as well as anything else. Sustainability. Now, all this talk about sustainability all over the place, and especially with the declining of funds for cross-border cooperation. But what does one mean by that? Particularly in the light of this partnership? Well, it means something entirely different for a private firm who wants to remain competitive in the marketplace. For a civil servant, it means public stable expenditure streams, and for a voluntary group, it means a viable mix of core and project funding, which isn't always that viable. And there are just list a few factors, I think, which affect the sustainability of cross-border cooperation. How am I doing for time? A couple of minutes. Right. The priority of financial commitment accorded to cross-border cooperation in the wake of declining external sources. Now, this is external sources, the American government, the IFI, the EU, and so on. External sources definitely declining, so it does come down to a matter of political commitment from the, or lack of, from the two state administrations. The demand for cooperative projects on the ground. Now that depends on a number of things, and previous experience and so on. The personal networks of project personnel, the degree and nature of the institutionalization of cooperation, the mainstreaming or not of cross-border cooperation, and grassroots support or legitimacy. So I think there's many levels at which these factors operate. I think I'll skip that because it takes me on to another research topic. Coming towards the end, it suggests some things a qualitative researcher might contribute to the policy process. Make connections between elements of what is a very fragmented policy process, no matter what you're talking about. Expose the culture informing policy making, the hidden and often conflicting cultures and meanings involved in issues like cross-border cooperation and urban regeneration, which is the other case. In the case of innovatory initiatives, recognise the inertia of existing institutions. And when you're dealing with two states and the EU, I can assure you there's a huge amount of inertia. Analyse the unequal power resources deployed in any policy field. Feedback findings not just to funders but to participants in the research. Adopt a critical approach to take it for granted terms, such as accountability. Is it accountability or is it ticking boxes? Right? Is it this kind of pseudo-accountability that we so much part of the cross-border projects that have been funded? Pay attention to the costs of not acting. Some years ago there was a big study done on the costs of non-Europe. The costs of not having cross-border cooperation. Very seldom looked at. Develop a historical perspective on public policy in any area and develop a comparative perspective. And I'll end with a quote from a very well-known interpretive American sociologist, Michael Burrow, where he says, the social scientist should be an ethnographic archaeologist who seeks out local experiments, new institutional forms, real utopias, who places them in their context, translates them into a common language, and links them one to another across the globe. And the point there being, of course, that the local should not be simply seen as the parochial, but actually the local can be connected to the globe. Thanks.